Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last, I guess, the last day. And I appreciate you coming on this early morning time to see this presentation. I'll start off by saying that I am not a cult expert, but I do believe the experience of children are similar to everything I've read about cults. So I'm thinking I'm in a room of experts on cult issues. So I appreciate that. I feel humbled to be here in front of you. My name is Cocchiola, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I have a doctorate in clinical social welfare where I researched under the tutelage of Dr. Evan Stark. He was on my committee, and I was so honored to meet him and then find out he lived 40 minutes from my house in Connecticut. So how cool is that? I have had dinner with his wife since his passing. There'll be a memorial service in September. I'm sure you're all familiar with who Dr. Evan Stark is. I mean, truly the propeller of the term coercive control. And so when I began this journey at the age of 19 as a domestic abuse, sexual assault crisis counselor, I became extremely passionate about the experiences of children as child victims. I worked in child welfare and saw over and over again the intersection between domestic abuse and child abuse. And as you know, historically, we've talked about domestic abuse when children are in those family systems as witnesses of or exposed to. And that's a bunch of malarkey, right? I mean, they are literally experiencing it side by side with the adult victim, even if they are not specifically the target. And I did this work for a long time and also was always looking through the violent incident model. I mean, that's historically how we've looked at domestic abuse. And today's discussion is really about that intersection of domestic abuse in the family system and cult ideology, right? The belief system behind cult leaders. And so I was in a relationship. I met my partner when I was 16 years old, and I was with him for over 27 years and 11 months, and only realized around year 20 that I was experiencing what I termed at the time psychological abuse. I didn't know the term coercive control yet. And then I divorced and experienced the significant post-separation abuse and recognized that my own children had been indoctrinated, get a little emotional here, since the ages of 9 and 10. And so the indoctrination of a cult leader for me is oftentimes the abusive parent. They do this in an attempt to weaponize the children. But of course, the primary target, as Dr. Evan Stark talks about in his most recent book that was published in 2023, is the primary target is the targeted parent, right? The partner. But the children become the weapons of this process. He calls them secondary victims, not because they're not as important, but because their victimization is not the priority of the abuser. And so I truly, like when I think about the family system and all of the work I've done, again, since the age of 19, did not know it was happening to me, but then became really immersed in these experiences of protective parents, we'll call them, assumed healthy, right? And these abusive parents, and the strategies they use are the grooming techniques that we see everywhere. So I will begin. That's my little intro. It's a cult of 1 or 2 or 3, depending on how many children are in the home, right? So children fulfill different roles in the family system. There can often be a scapegoat. There can often be a golden child, oftentimes there is, and there's often the lost child, right? And these family systems support that. What we don't talk often enough about is that the primary scapegoat is the adult targeted parent, right? That's who the primary scapegoat is. But it doesn't mean that children don't fulfill that role, and they do. And what we see happening over and over again is that these roles switch in the family system, particularly with children. I might be the scapegoated child today, but tomorrow I might become the golden child if I maybe won, I don't know, I was on Spain's soccer team and I won last night, right? I will become this golden child. I will be elevated in the family system. So I never know as a child really I have no solidification of who I am. I never really clearly get that autonomy that every child, of course, deserves to have. So a little trigger warning about this presentation, because it can be triggering, and I'm a social worker first and always want to ensure that people know how to get support. I understand if you have to leave or take a pause. So it can occur everywhere and anywhere, okay? The coercive controller, narcissistic abuser, and why do I use that term? I recently spoke with Dr. Ramani in Dubai at 2 different events on mental health awareness, and we talked about the fact that the term narcissistic abuse doesn't necessarily mean that someone is diagnosed with NPD, right? And it does mean that somebody uses the traits of harmful narcissism to abuse. They use those traits. And really what she and I agree upon, and she actually just wrote the foreword to a forthcoming book that I co-authored with a colleague, Amy Polacco. And I'll talk about that at the end. But in it, she talked about how she deals with people, and she just did her own book that was New York Times bestseller 3 times. It's not you, right? And the idea that narcissism, of course, is a spectrum, but that I deal mostly with the people that we would say are 8, 9s, and 10s. These are people who take their narcissistic traits and they need to exert power and control over people in any way. And we talked about the dark tetrad, right? So this is narcissism, Machiavellianism. It's also psychopathy, willing to break the law, but also in that sadism. I don't really care how much this hurts you. I actually want to hurt you to gain control and to get you to get revenge, right? Hell bent on revenge is what we talk about, right? So it's a psychological manipulation. And, you know, the cult leader also in some cases, right? And also a child predator. And when in the family system, the children are the most harmed. Thank you so much for offering to give me this. Oops, backwards. No. Okay, so can't do this without highlighting Dr. Evan Stark, right? And as you know, he passed away this year, and he was actually working at his desk when he passed away. He was doing a podcast in the UK talking about coercive control. And so in any case, he is of course a hero in the world. And if you haven't read his second book, he talks all about the research based experiences of children. And, you know, what I say is that, you know, I think Dr. Stark, I'm not sure he'd be very proud of me for using narcissistic abuse. We've had debates, he and I, about that. But I think that also for many people helps them. It's a thread. It's a term that people have become very familiar with and is helpful. He also didn't, I did a research study called Perfect Prey, because I believe that abusers choose their victims wisely. And those of you who are here, you know, he said using perfect prey is like, what was his exact quote? He said, a lot of good it will do knowing why you got into this relationship when the abuser has the heel of his boot on your neck. That's what he said. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really profound. Except that abusers do know who are people that are going to be more accommodating. Just simply put, as Sandra Brown talks about, super traits, like people who are giving in relationships, people who try very hard, people who want things to work out. Imagine that right between 2 partners. Like there's one partner who doesn't work hard. I actually have, I hope, an article coming out on the gaslighting by therapists. As a therapist, I see all of the time. We go to therapy with a partner, nobody's asking, is he an abuser? Well, if there's been no physical violence, that's why people don't ask. When actually the parental subsystem has been framed upon one person exerting power and control over the other person. And so we have a problem, like in the social work psychology world, where we are not acknowledging, or we have arrogant people who are working within the court system, which is what my book is about with Amy Polacco, this idea that, you know, 50-50 is the best way to go with child custody, instead of actually looking at, again, who is an abuser, and even if it hasn't been physical violence, we need to be looking at that. So, you know, where Dr. Stark says is that where there are children, they become the choice weapon. Some people have used pawn, some people, they are pawns, but some people have used tool, but honestly, weapon, the intent is a lot stronger. And that is truly what these abusers are doing. So it is when one person in a relationship uses a pattern of behavior to maintain power and control over another person, absent of or including physical violence. What's important is physical violence is not the defining characteristic. Oftentimes, when these abusers become more physically violent, it's when they've lost control. They're using the physical violence as another tactic to regain control, right? That's why threat and intimidation, all of those things are present. For me, I see coercive control as the foundation of all abuse. I see it as the foundation of sex trafficking. Absolutely, right? I see it as the foundation of child predators, right? Child sexual abuse. I see it as the foundation of racism, sexism. You name any ism, it's about one person or one group of people wanting to exert power and control over one person or one group of people. I mean, for me, I wish that we could just call all abusers coercive controllers, because to me, that feels like it covers everything. And this is the problem. I've seen this recently where someone was doing a TED talk and they talk about it as hidden abuse or invisible abuse. That's not true. Coercive control can be verbal assaults. Threatening behavior, intimidation, blocking someone's leeway from a room is abuse. That's physical. Right? And so sexual abuse, of course, is physical, even if we don't actually like talk about it or someone hasn't disclosed it, right? So really thinking about coercive control in a more global way. It can be physical. It doesn't have to be, but when it is, it gets that's when it's the most threatening and when people actually end up dying. That's when homicide, femicide, and filicides occur, right? But also, of course, it can be psychological in nature, and that's what people have focused on. Psychological, when actually they haven't looked broadly. It is legal abuse. It is financial abuse. It is sexual abuse. It's all of those things. If I had one wish, it would be that everyone would stop calling it invisible abuse. It's not. I was reading something yesterday, a book a woman wrote about her experiences, and she said she suffered emotional abuse, legal abuse, and coercive control. And like, it's all coercive control. That would be the vetting that I would hope happened. So it's the indoctrination of the adult victim, and that of children is similar. It's like a cult, and Biderman's prisoners of war. Victims are worn down and often acquiesce and even align. And if you came in a few minutes after I started talking, I said, you guys are the cult experts. I am not. I know you know about Biderman, right? For adults, there is no choice, but of course, for children, there is no choice. And they are in the developmental stages of their life. They are so easily impacted by other people's behaviors. So, you know, Biderman talked about unethical mind control, also known as coercive psychological systems, includes brainwashing. These children are being brainwashed. I explained my children being brainwashed, right? So at 17 and 19, I finally decided to leave my ex. And there was a physical incident at my house that my daughter was involved in because, well, she was involved in a physical incident because he wouldn't let her go to her job. Because he was mad at who? Me. Right? He was mad because I was leaving him. So post-separation abuse is also coercive control, right? So in that day, we're in the car and I said, when did this start? Now remember, she's 17. She tells me when I was 9, when I was in 3rd grade and you and Dad had that incident and you went to work that night. When you left, Dad told us that you cheated, that you were unstable, that you could not be trusted, that you were not on your antidepressants. And so it came from him in a loving way. I'm just worried about your mom. I'm so sorry this happened. It's just really concerning, you know, that she would think all these things about me when actually she's the one doing this. You see how the indoctrination, oh my gosh, tables were entirely flipped on a 9 and a 10-year-old at the time. Now, fast forward, she's 17 when she tells me that. How many years of living in a cult did the both of them have? Now, if that's my family system, and I actually educate on the topic, I teach social work every day to my college social work students. I teach on the power and abuse, the Duluth power and abuse model. And I didn't know it was happening to me. I didn't know it was happening to my kids. How many people are living in this world that are experiencing this, right? If 35% of women, and yes, I'm saying women because women typically are more often victims. If 35% of women suffer abuse and violence in their lifetime, that's the violence. What of the women who aren't suffering violence? And now how many children? Those are the stats that are startling, right? So interpersonal methods, positive persuasion, that's a big one. I'm just worried about your mom. I have moms who will like reach out to me and he would say to them all the time, go lay down, you're so tired, you've had a long day. She thinks he's caring for her. In the meantime, he's telling the kids that she's always tired. It doesn't sound awful. Mom's just tired, right? The positive persuasion, such as compliments. Of course, these kids are constantly getting compliments. Or you're the best mom in the world. What do we say to children? right? Oh, be nice to your mom. She loves you so much, but when she's not around, what is he saying? Right? And again, I'm using he, this happens both ways in these family violence situations, these family relationship dynamics. I don't want to use violence because it's not always physically violent. Promises or special attention, being nice can be a powerful weapon. These are the parents who tend to be hero parents, right? So give the child whatever they want, right? And I see this happening over and over again. Parents separate. The child actually, the parents separate and the child is living between two homes, but now one parent is giving a child a phone when they had lived together, maybe they wouldn't have gotten a phone already, right? At 8 years old or 10 years old. Or they're getting a car purchase for them, right? Anything to entice them and to pull them in. And then of course the threats of this, the kids always know there are threats. What is that about? That's really about knowing that I am not loved unconditionally. That is huge. These children know that if they don't behave a certain way, they're not going to be loved by that. They've seen what happens to the scapegoated parent. Do you understand? They know that that scapegoated parent is sometimes being put down and sometimes maybe sometimes being elevated a little bit in the home. And so if that's happening, if let's just say dad is saying that about my mom a lot, what's going on with me? Where do I stand in this relationship? Okay, so what we know is that Emma Katz talks about it in her research, Children of Coercive Control. She talks about dangerous fathering. And again, fathering, we're talking about specifically here. But she talks about this idea that children are afraid of, right? And so I think it's really important to highlight that, coercive control is foundational, Dr. Evan Stark would agree, in patriarchy. Right? And so the patriarchal norms that we have in our society typically offend women more than men, but that does not mean that men are not offended. I love Jackson Katz's work, right? He talks about engaging boys and girls, men and women in the conversation about delineating patriarchy, right? Because that is harmful to everyone. So she talks about dangerous fathering, the guy who's banging on the door, let me in, the kids are afraid, maybe is physically violent. She talks about the admirable father. That ends up sounding a little bit like, that cult leader that we feel bad for, or we're like, just trying to do a good job. I think of Keith Raniere, right? Like that, like victim status. He's just trying to do a good job. He's just trying to help people, right? Okay, so that victim status, you could imagine children, what do? They take on taking care of their parent. A divorce or a separation happens, and all of a sudden now it's the kid's job because they feel bad. Well, you took all of dad's money, or you took all of mom's money, right? So the narrative is already happening. Again, I always say these abusers start day one. The moment a child is born, literally, the moment a child is born, an abuser knows what matters most to the targeted parent. They know. And they begin at a very slow, insidious, and a nuanced way to undermine that protected parent in some way, to make that protected parent seem less trustworthy, to betray the child's desire and need for attachment. It's all about attachment, by the way. So, omnipresent, just these abusers you just always know you have to regulate your behavior. They're always omnipresent. Whether they're home or not home, their car pulls into the driveway, oh, dad's home. Maybe you have to behave a certain way. Kids learn this at a very young age, how to regulate their behavior. I don't have time, obviously, today, and this is not what this presentation is about, but I specifically teach how protected parents can provide their children with as much of a safe haven. One of the things that they need to know is that these kids always have significant anxiety, social anxiety and otherwise, because they have had to regulate their behavior at a very young age in the home. They have known that they had to behave a certain way in order to be accepted and loved. And so because of that, their anxiety levels are super high. And I believe that a lot of the children who are diagnosed with anxiety disorders may in fact have one parent that they haven't been able to freely be authentically themselves. And that doesn't mean that parent's an abuser. It just means maybe they haven't been able to attach in the healthiest way. So the Sullivanian commune, this was in the 1950s, I believe. It's just, I think it's a really good example of how cults have done this. What they did is they tried, of course, they sexualize children. We see that often, right? In cults when children are involved, right? But they basically condemned any attachment other than to the group and its leaders for the children. They actually, you know, the isolation of children from the parents was a big thing, right? And so parents were told attachment to children isn't good. You shouldn't have an attachment to your children. But basically, these abusers, this is exactly what they do. They're trying to maliciously fracture that attachment to the protective parent. So I'm showing you the Duluth Power post-separation abuse wheel because it really encompasses all the things that happen in the family system. You can download this. Don't download, I mean, this one for me is the one that has been research-based by domestic abuse shelters. And what I would say to you is that it's the same idea that a coercive controller is the person exerting this power and control. Post-separation is when it really intensifies. Over 90% of coercive control cases intensify post-separation. They don't get better. We tell victims to leave all the time. Why haven't you left? If it was that bad, why didn't you go? There was a research study out of California. It's a relatively old one done by some pretty prominent researchers, Tace and Sorensen. We don't have access to these resources, but out of 231 female victims who received restraining orders, within 2 or 3 days, a fifth of them were murdered. Yes. So we tell women to leave. We tell them to get restraining orders. And then we know that what's going to happen is things are going to intensify and get worse, right? And so how many times have we heard about, and even the way the media portrays these, you know, dad with wonderful reputation murders mother, instead of like, you know, like switching that up and saying man murder, you know, right? So understanding that it's also our vernacular that's off. And that if we really sat down and thought about it, it is an epidemic. 3 women die a day due to domestic abuse. That's a huge epidemic worldwide, right? 35%, as I said, suffer violence in their lifetime. So what I took the post-separation abuse wheel and kind of just condensed it for you. So, you know, they discredit her as mother, disrupt her relationship with her children, disregard the children, even endanger the children. Now, again, women can do this too. Women do not have the same amount of power in society, but I'm sure you all know mothers who have indoctrinated the children against a good dad, right? Okay. Contradicting parent rules for children, coercing children to ally with the abuser, degrading parent to the children, using children as spies. This is so easy to do now, of course, with these little tags, these Apple tags, with phones, you know, location services. I always tell my moms, get your children another phone, or don't you tell him you'll pay or whoever it is, you'll pay the phone bill, so that because these abusers are tracking who their children are contacting, and if they're contacting their mother. So I have moms who are so upset. They're like, she goes away for the week for the visit with her dad every other week. These horrible, by the way, custody arrangements, week off, week on, or even the 224, they're horrible to a child's developing brain. That being said, in my opinion, if whoever the primary caretaker was the child's entire life, that plan should be the plan that courts are actually using. So if mom was away on, you know, in New York City every night until 9 p.m. working, and he was the stay-at-home dad, he was doing 80% of the care, he should be receiving 80% of the custody. That's who the child's primarily been connected to. So, you know, using children as spies is so easy to do when you can track a phone, and these kids are not going to reach out to the protective parent because they know the other parent, they don't know the other parent sees their phone locked. The other parent just says, oh, you talked to mom, and makes the kid feel guilty and bad for doing so. Isolating the children from the parent and isolating the parent from the children. So it is a malicious fracturing of attachment. That's what I call it. For me, it's all attachment based. Children need a secure attachment to at least one primary caretaker in their lifetime. Now, there are some kids who do okay without that. But the idea behind it is that if I am an abuser, the number one thing that I want is control over everyone. And if I could make my child feel less agency in the home, have this inability to be authentically themselves, then I will be able to fracture their attachment to the healthy parent, and certainly their attachment to me will never be healthy. And in that, I can control them. This is why some children align. People ask me, how come, my 12-year-old aligned and my, 10-year-old didn't? Well, first of all, wait a minute, because your 10-year-old's only 10. This is the problem. The most vulnerable time, in my opinion, from the work I've done, is right around teens, because I can use that admirable fathering. I can pull in and let you have more freedom and let you do what you want to do. And in that, I pull you in. So that attachment with the primary, that protective parent needs to be so fortified. People think it's silly, but like in the world, we do not have a really good understanding of how important connection is, I believe. I grew up with parents who were more of a correct, right? Lovely parents, but it was correction. What we need to do with these children is they're going to behave badly because they are so dysregulated. They're going to behave badly. They're going to be raw. And you know who they're going to be most raw with? The safest. Exactly. And so if they're going to be raw with me and I'm going to be reactive and correcting, does that help our connection? Now I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but let's just talk about Bruce Perry's like neurosequential modeling of the brain. I'm living in reptilian mode all the time. I'm survivor. Always living in reptilian mode. My kids are coming home, calling me a sociopath, telling me I took all the family's money. And I want to correct. My child's living in reptilian mode too. And they are constantly dysregulated. And guess what? The number one healing is for dysregulation, connection. And guess what? So then we say, how come they can't see? I have a mom with a 14-year-old who was beaten by his father at 12. Court didn't give a shit. Sorry, I do swear sometimes. Right? Court did not care. Court did not care. Children had shared custody. This 12-year-old who's now 14 is aligned with his father. Why? Because connection was fractured and he couldn't cognitively process, which is the upper part of our brain. Right? So the ability to really cognitively process what happened and make the connections is totally diffused by an abusive parent. And so it's so important that we're teaching protective parents how to actually constantly create that connection at all costs. So important. So the kids deal with disassociation, trauma bonding. There's so many things they deal with, right? But I'm just going to go over a few of them really quick. How am I doing for 15 minutes? Okay, great. Okay. So they destabilize the target just like they do in cults, right? Okay. They want to hold on to something solid and secure. Children, more than anyone, want to hold on to something solid and secure. Let me just say this. If the protected parent is victim-like, weak, reasonably so, after years of being abused, reactive over and over again, right? Do they feel strong to the child? No. I tell my protective parents to fake it till you make it, because honestly, the brain will heal. If you think you feel okay, if you think you're doing okay, your brain actually does heal. That's the good news, okay? But people are like, really? Fake it till I make it? Yeah. Like be a performer on stage. When your children come home dysregulated and they're behaving like they're in a cult over there, they come home, they treat you horribly. You need to actually like kind of be a therapist on stage. That's what my program actually teaches, is how do you teach protective parents to be therapeutic in the home and to see themselves not necessarily as a parent in this situation, but as an ally, right? So, obviously this happens quite frequently. This is what happens to children. As we know about trauma bonding, which you guys all know, the children distrust their own judgment. They don't know. They're like on a tightrope. They're like, I don't know who to trust. I don't know who to believe. The only way they begin to know who to believe is when that protective parent shows up differently than the false narrative. They have to show up differently than that false narrative. They can't be as emotional. They can't be maybe as angry. They can't yell as much, right? And so all that dysregulation response is the maladaptive coping that they have learned due to an abusive relationship and maybe due to their own childhood is not going to be helpful if they want their child to heal. I always say that we can heal in synergy together with our children, right? And so these kids don't know who to trust because of that. You know, and so specifically, Ballin and Brassard and Stark and Hester did talk about this trauma bonding as a deliberate brainwashing during which the individual purposefully weakens the child's autonomy. So protective parents have to really fortify a child's attachment to them, but also give them agency as much as possible, which is really hard when they're able to stay up till midnight at 8 years old with their iPads, right? And then they come home to your house and you don't want them on the iPad, but remember, how much can you really, I always say, we're not parenting the same children. They're abuse victims. They're child abuse victims that no one is acknowledging as being victims of child abuse. So these two books are, of course, seminal, right? And Jennifer Fry's work cannot talk about children indoctrinated. She doesn't specifically talk about indoctrination, but she talks about this process of being blind to the betrayal. Her original work was about children who were victims of sexual abuse. Why is it? This is where Darbo comes from. Darbo came from this idea that children would disclose and then they would be shut down for disclosing. They would be the whistleblower. Or the protective parent would say, he sexually abused my child, and then the protective parent would be the whistleblower, right? And so it's about being blind to the betrayal because honestly, that feels a lot safer than anything else, right? And so what was I gonna say about Darbo? I mean, I just think it's important to recognize that this is what happens to protective parents in family court all of the time. So abusers deny what happened, they attack, they reverse victim and offender. I see this happening every single day with protective parents in the family court system. So she further explains that when a parent who is offended degrades what is a fundamental part of a child's development, their relationship, that attachment to that protective parent, they may need to disassociate from the trauma simply because their survival emotionally or otherwise depends upon it. And so I can't talk about any of this without going back to my roots. So originally I was a child sexual abuse educator in the state of Connecticut. And what I see over and over again is the grooming tactics by predators are identical to what I see in coercively controlling relationships. I believe it's identical to what happens for people engaging in cults. And so I'm sure I'm not speaking like you guys are like, yeah, of course it is. But I think in general, we need to be educating more about that, the intersection of those things. So obviously identifying the target, gaining the trust. I said this groundwork is laid for the slow erosion of the victim's autonomy in stage 3. The slow and insidious erosion of the victim's autonomy is now occurring and trauma bonding is in full swing. Isolating the child, I mean, I see this over and over again, where these perpetrators, like, you know, the child has like, they're engaged with like extended family on the protective parent side. And now this abuser will say things like, you don't want to go to grandma's, or, you know, grandma's kind of weird, or she yelled at you last time you were there. So they like to fracture those relationships in the extended family, again, isolating the child. This is like hugely problematic. Take an adult victim who feels very isolated, who feels very gaslit by the world, not allowed to share what really happened. What do people always say? Did that really happen? Could it have been that bad? Yeah, my ex locked me out of my family home. Yes, I left them out with the items in the trunk of my car. Me, an educator, I'm on domestic abuse. Yes, this happens. This is what they do. Creating the permanency of the relationship. And this occurs naturally, right? This is not a stranger, right? First of all, stranger danger is BS, right? 93% of child victims of sexual abuse are people known to them, right? And so knowing that even if it's not sexual abuse, the predatory nature is the same, and then controlling the relationship. And sometimes that's by gifts, by giving more freedom. And so can't talk about any of this without talking about Stephen Hassan's work, right? So the false identity, the conditional love, right? The hate that occurs, the doctrine, the belief system, right? So I have children who hate their protective parent, who they were so attached to and had an amazing relationship with, right? The solemnity, the fear and the guilt, the dependence and the obedience. I would say that when I think about this, I think about what Dr. Evan Stark said. He said, coercive control is like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a home. You don't even know if it's happening. It's happening until it's too late. I think that statement is the nutshell of what happens to adult victims that we are not talking about is happening to the children and they don't even know it's happening. That's the missing component. And from a developing perspective, someone I depend upon, I don't even know this is happening to me. So I'm filled with significant betrayal. I'm filled with this idea of who, like, again, this betrayal trauma, this trust. The foundation of trust is annihilated, basically, for these children. Just like it would be with adults, except as you can imagine, it's so much more compound. And so what do we know about these children? We know that they are, I mean, hindsight is 20/20, but that they really need protective parents and clinicians. I'm training therapists now on how to help children. I have so many therapists who, again, the intention may be good, but they're gaslighting. I have people doing repair therapy with an abuser. Would anybody in a cult be expected to sit in a room and repair with the cult leader? Ever. I just can't, it makes my blood boil that people therapists actually think this is an ethical thing to do. It is so unethical. Reunification camps. Are you kidding me? I mean, even if a child is indoctrinated falsely and doesn't want to go to a reunification camp with who their protective parent is, let's just say, do we coerce and control it to get them to change their mind? No, right? And so really knowing how can we help them? It's foundational skills, helping them with empathy building skills, because abusers love it when children have no empathy. If you have no empathy, you can't actually make a decision by your authentic self. Give them critical thinking skills outside of the relationship. We don't have to say dad or mom is an abuser or what they did is wrong. We can talk about somebody at work who took our parking spot 3 times in a row, and we realize that that is really inappropriate, and we are going to talk to them, and this is how we're going to talk to them. Our children can catch us on the phone having a conversation with someone who mistreated us, and how did we handle it? Timeline, give them an ability to narrate what their experiences are. Children disassociate very quickly the good experiences with the protective parent. Over and over again, they will forget them. We have to remind them, right? Role playing, this is like more clinical, but role playing, but we can do this as a parent too. Give them an echo map. For those of us who are, if you're not a therapist, like basically put a picture of you in the middle. Okay, a child can draw or their name, and then they can put circles all around it to show all the people in their life. And then they can begin to, with lines, decide if this relationship is one that brings value to their life or not. I ask my protective parents to do this. How many times have you had a bunch of relationships and then people find out you're an abuse victim and all of a sudden you've lost a lot of relationships, right? Those relationships weren't healthy, right? Love languages for children. I don't agree with the love languages idea, but it's really helpful as a protective parent to know how your child likes to receive love. If you can focus on that, it will help. I don't think it's helpful in adult situations. If you haven't heard, it's kind of patriarchal. It says like men like intimacy all the time and physical touch. I mean, yeah. So quality time, creating that recollection of authentic positive memories. I tell protective parents, take out photo books. Make sure your children are remembering that time that they were sitting on your lap when they were waiting to maybe go into the doctor and you were giving them a hug. Make sure that they remember these things. Understanding their own somatic experiences by sharing yours. Oh my gosh, that did not feel good to my body. Oh my gosh, did that feel okay to your body when that happened? Let them begin to feel it, because what abusers want to do is gaslight our intuition. They do it with adult victims all the time. And what we do as protective parents is we disintegrate our children's intuition, because we actually pretend everything's okay in the family system. Think things aren't, we're not sure, but we don't want to argue. So we're walking around eggshells, and then the children don't really know what's right and what's wrong anymore. We have totally disintegrated their intuition. Make sure children feel their intuition and that they actually are able to express it. And then again, positive memories. So many children living in these situations are under a brainwashed, conditioned love. There's no real actual love going on. I hate it when people say, but that's your father. He loves you so much. No, he doesn't. He doesn't know how to love. He doesn't know how to love a child as a child is supposed to receive love. The children live in fear, whether overtly or covertly. You may not see it. They align or be punished. They're no different than Biderman's prisoners of war. It is an unacknowledged child abuse. I wanted to share with you, I have a podcast called Perfect Prey, where I talk specifically about the experiences of children. I'm beginning interviewing young adults who have experienced coercive control in their family system. That's going to be starting in September, but I talk about grief and loss, which my protective parenting program is totally focused on that idea. Like, this is all a huge loss as a parent. When any kind of cult relationship, of course, is a huge loss. But imagine that you're parenting a child that you thought there was a connection to, and all of a sudden someone robbed that from you, right? And how do you help your children? And they're grieving and nobody even acknowledges the child's grief. And then I have some trainings that I do for coaches and attorneys and clinicians. So, and then I wanted to share, my colleague and I are coming out with a book. It's coming out by the end of July. Pre-orders will be available. It's called Framed: Women in the Family Court Underworld. So I know I know men can be victims. However, let me just give you a little quick stat about women in the family court underworld. When a woman comes forward and says she's been domestically abused in family court, there's a research study out, was done over 10 years by Joan Meyer and colleagues. She is believed less than 55% of the time for domestic abuse. When she says her children have been physically abused, she is believed 27% of the time. And when she says her children have been sexually abused, 15% of the time. So what happens in the family court system is it's based on hierarchy. There's lots of research out there. Bala, Saunders have done lots of research, other Jaffe, I can name a million, where basically what we know is that the system is built on patriarchy and there's judicial immunity. Judges can make decisions and it doesn't matter how it impacts the family system. And so we have about 22 stories in this book where we talk about the experiences of women in the family court underworld. If you know a woman, or you are a woman and you care about women, or you have a child who you know someday will be dating, etc., it's a warning, but it's also a validation.